A man stands outside a tomb. He knows, with total certainty, that in less than a minute he is about to raise the person inside back to life. And yet, standing there, he weeps. Not composed grief. Not a single dignified tear. The Greek word John uses describes audible, visible sobbing, the same word used elsewhere for loud lamentation. Why would someone cry over a death he is seconds away from reversing? There's a reason this two-word verse has outlasted whole chapters of surrounding text in cultural memory, quoted more often, painted more often, and preached on more often than almost any other single line from any of the four Gospels combined. It says almost nothing on its surface, and yet it says almost everything about how the Gospel writers wanted their central figure understood, not as a distant miracle worker moving through human suffering untouched by it, but as someone who stood in the middle of exactly the kind of pain every reader eventually faces, and let it register fully, without flinching and without explaining it away in the moment it actually happened. This is one of the strangest, most quietly devastating details in the entire New Testament, and it comes from a story most people think they already know: Lazarus, raised from the dead by Jesus in the town of Bethany. But the raising isn't actually the part worth sitting with. It's the two words that come just before it, the shortest verse in the entire Bible, and one of the most theologically loaded: Jesus wept. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of Scripture as much as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Today we're going to walk through this story slowly, verse by verse, because almost every retelling skips the exact detail that makes it so strange. We'll look at why Jesus deliberately delayed his arrival, what his own disciples said about the danger of even going near Bethany, what Martha and Mary each said to him separately, why he wept when he already knew the ending, and what this single, tiny sentence reveals about who the Gospel writers believed Jesus actually was. Let's start with the setup, because the timeline itself is the first strange detail. John tells us plainly that Jesus loved Martha, her sister Mary, and their brother Lazarus. When Lazarus falls seriously ill, the sisters send an urgent message: "Lord, he whom you love is ill." This isn't a distant acquaintance. This is one of Jesus's closest circles of friends, outside his own 12 disciples, a household he stayed in, ate with, and was clearly emotionally attached to. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable before it gets miraculous. John records that when Jesus hears the news, he stays where he is for 2 more full days. Not because he's unavailable, not because the message got lost. The text is explicit that he deliberately remains in place. He even tells his disciples directly, "This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." In other words, Jesus knows exactly what's happening, and chooses delay anyway. By the time Jesus finally says, "Let us go to Judea again," his disciples are alarmed. The last time Jesus was in that region, the religious authorities had tried to stone him. "Rabbi," they say, "the Jews were just now seeking to stone you. And are you going there again?" This wasn't a casual visit. Going back to Judea was a genuine, immediate physical risk to Jesus' life, and his disciples knew it. Thomas, the same disciple later remembered mainly for doubting the resurrection, says something easy to miss, but remarkable in context: "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Whatever else Thomas gets criticized for elsewhere, in this moment he's willing to walk into danger out of loyalty. When Jesus finally arrives, Lazarus has already been in the tomb 4 days. This detail matters more than it might seem. Jewish burial customs of the period held, in some traditions, that a person's spirit lingered near the body for up to 3 days after death, holding out some possibility of return. By day 4, that possibility was considered closed. Culturally and physically, 4 days signaled something final and irreversible. Not a coma, not a premature burial, but unambiguous, settled death. It helps to understand what death actually meant to the people standing in that story, because first-century Jewish belief about what happens after death was neither simple nor unanimous, and that uncertainty is part of what makes Martha and Mary's grief so raw. By the time of Jesus, Jewish thought on the afterlife had split into competing camps. The Sadducees, who tended to come from the priestly and aristocratic classes, rejected the idea of bodily resurrection altogether, holding that death was final, and that the soul, if it persisted at all, did so only in a shadowy, diminished form. The Pharisees, by contrast, had come to affirm a future bodily resurrection, a belief rooted partly in later Old Testament passages, like Daniel's vision of the dead, awakening some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt, and partly in centuries of theological development during the intertestamental period. Martha's own words to Jesus reflect exactly this Pharisaic framework. When Jesus tells her that her brother will rise again, she answers, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." That's not a vague hope. It's a specific, structured doctrine she already holds, placing the resurrection safely in the far future, at the end of history, not as something she expects to see acted out in front of her in the next few minutes. This is exactly why Jesus' next statement lands with such force. He doesn't correct her theology. He relocates it. "I am the resurrection," and the life takes a doctrine Martha believed, applied only to some distant future event, and places it, present tense, directly in front of her, standing at her brother's grave. The resurrection isn't a future event Jesus merely predicts or guarantees from a distance. In his own words, it's something he personally is. Martha, hearing that Jesus is finally approaching, goes out to meet him while Mary stays home. Her opening line is startlingly direct, almost accusatory. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." It's not phrased as a question. It's a statement of what should have happened, aimed straight at the person she believes could have prevented it. And yet, in the very next breath, she adds something that shows her faith hasn't collapsed alongside her grief. "But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Grief and trust, held together in the same two sentences. Jesus responds with one of his most direct self-descriptions anywhere in the Gospels. "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? Martha's answer is a full, formal confession. "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world." This exchange happens before Lazarus is raised, before any visible miracle has occurred. Martha's faith isn't built on witnessing the resurrection. It's already there, spoken directly to Jesus' face, while her brother is still dead in the tomb. It's worth pausing on "I am the resurrection" and the life as a piece of language on its own, because John's Gospel is famously structured around a series of these "I am" statements, and this one belongs to a very specific, deliberate pattern that runs through the entire book. Earlier in John, Jesus says, "I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the way, and the truth, and the life." And later, after this scene, "I am the true vine." Scholars have long noted that this phrasing echoes, in Greek, the divine name God gives Moses at the burning bush, "I am who I am," and that John seems to be deliberately drawing that connection for readers already steeped in the Hebrew Scriptures. Each of these statements attaches an enormous, totalizing claim to an ordinary noun. Not "I can give you bread," but "I am bread itself." Not "I can guide you to the truth," but "I am the truth." Set against that pattern, "I am the resurrection," and the life stands out as arguably the boldest of the seven, because it's the only one tested immediately, on camera, within the same scene. Jesus doesn't just assert this identity and move on to the next teaching moment. Within minutes, standing at an actual grave with an actual 4 days dead body inside it, he backs the claim up with a specific, observable, historical action. Whatever else these "I am" statements are doing theologically, this is the one moment in John's Gospel where the abstract claim and the concrete proof sit directly beside each other in the same short scene, with no gap of time or geography separating the words from the demonstration. Martha then goes and quietly tells her sister Mary that Jesus is asking for her. Mary rises quickly and goes to him, and a crowd of mourners who had been comforting her follows, assuming she's going to weep at the tomb. When Mary reaches Jesus, she falls at his feet and says the exact same opening line Martha used, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Same words, same accusation, wrapped in grief. But John records a very different response from Jesus this time. With Martha, he responds with theology, a direct statement about who he is. With Mary, weeping at his feet, surrounded by a grieving crowd, he responds completely differently. John writes, "When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled." The Greek phrase behind deeply moved is unusually strong. It's related to a word elsewhere, used for the snorting of horses, suggesting something closer to a visceral, almost physical surge of emotion than a calm, composed sadness. This isn't gentle sympathy. It's something closer to being shaken. He asks where they have laid him. They say, "Lord, come and see." And then comes the verse, "Jesus wept." It's worth a brief detour here on why we even call it the shortest verse in the Bible. Because that description, while true in most popular English translations, is actually a fact about later editorial decisions rather than about the original text itself. The Gospels, as originally written, had no chapter numbers and no verse numbers at all. They were continuous, unbroken blocks of Greek text, read aloud in whole passages rather than cited by individual line. Chapter divisions weren't introduced until the 13th century, widely attributed to Archbishop Stephen Langton, and the verse numbers familiar to modern readers weren't added until the 16th century, when a printer named Robert Estienne divided the New Testament into the numbered verses still used today. So when people say Jesus wept is the shortest verse in the Bible, they're describing an artifact of a printing decision made more than 1,500 years after John wrote the account, not a structural feature John himself built into the text. In the original Greek, it's just 3 words, edokrisin hoisis, literally wept the Jesus, sitting inside a longer, continuous flow of narrative with no special formatting marking it out at all. If anything, that makes the line more remarkable, not less. Centuries of editors, working independently across different eras and translation traditions, kept landing on natural sentence breaks that isolated this exact phrase as its own self-contained unit. Because, grammatically, in nearly every language it's been rendered into, it simply doesn't need anything else attached to it. Its brevity isn't a formatting trick. It's a genuine feature of how starkly the original sentence stands on its own. Here's the detail that makes this moment so theologically strange, and it's worth stating plainly. Jesus already knows he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. He said as much to his disciples days earlier. He is not weeping from uncertainty, or from believing this ending is permanent, and yet he weeps anyway, genuinely, visibly, audibly, in front of a crowd of mourners who immediately draw their own conclusion. The text records the crowd's exact reaction. See how he loved him. But then, immediately, a second, sharper reaction from others in the same crowd. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Even in the moment of his own grief, some in the crowd are questioning him. So why the tears if the ending is already secured? This is where the passage rewards slow reading rather than a quick summary. One answer many readers land on is that Jesus' grief isn't primarily about Lazarus' current state. He knows that's about to be reversed. It's grief over death itself, over what death does to the people left standing at the graveside, over the fact that a good world was never supposed to include this kind of loss in the first place. His tears aren't a contradiction of his power. They're evidence that having the power to fix something doesn't erase the cost of it happening at all. He grieves the wound, even while already holding the cure in his hand. There's a second layer worth naming directly. This moment functions as one of the clearest pieces of evidence in the entire gospel tradition against a certain flattened, almost robotic picture of Jesus that shows up constantly in casual conversation. The idea of someone so fully in control, so certain of the outcome, that ordinary human emotion simply doesn't apply to him anymore. John explicitly, deliberately shows the opposite. The same person about to perform one of his most dramatic recorded miracles is, in the verse immediately before it, described crying in front of a crowd. Divine certainty and full human grief, sitting in the same body, in the same minute, with no contradiction the text feels any need to resolve or explain away. It's also worth setting this moment against the wider cultural expectations of the world John's first readers actually lived in. Because how a respected teacher or leader was supposed to handle grief in public was a live, contested question across the ancient Mediterranean, and Jesus's visible tears would have read very differently depending on which cultural lens a first-century reader brought to the story. In Stoic philosophy, which had wide influence across the Greco-Roman world by this period, the ideal wise person cultivated apatheia, a settled freedom from being disturbed by external events, including loss. Public weeping, especially from a man, especially from someone claiming authority or wisdom, could be read in some Greco-Roman circles as a loss of self-mastery, a sign that a person hadn't yet achieved the composure a sage was supposed to have over his own emotions. Some later Greco-Roman writers explicitly criticized excessive public grief as unmanly or undignified for a person of stature. Jewish tradition, by contrast, generally held a very different view. Open, vocal mourning wasn't shameful at all, but expected, even prescribed. With the Hebrew scriptures full of extended, unembarrassed grief, Abraham weeping for Sarah, David crying out for his son Absalom, entire communities gathering to mourn loudly and visibly for days at a time. Set against that backdrop, Jesus's tears aren't culturally neutral. To a reader steeped in Stoic ideals of composed, self-controlled leadership, a teacher weeping openly in front of a crowd would have looked almost countercultural, even faintly scandalous. To a reader steeped in Jewish mourning tradition, it would have looked expected, even necessary, proof that Jesus was genuinely present to the loss rather than standing apart from it. John doesn't seem interested in making Jesus fit the more restrained, composed model of leadership that dominated much of the wider Greco-Roman world around him. If anything, this scene deliberately leans the other way, presenting a teacher whose authority is demonstrated, not undermined, by the fact that he grieves openly and without any apparent concern for how it might look to onlookers holding him to a different standard. Jesus, again described as deeply moved, comes to the tomb, a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. He says, "Take away the stone." Martha, ever practical, objects immediately, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." It's a small human detail that grounds the entire scene. Nobody here is pretending this is anything other than a real, decomposing body behind that stone. Jesus responds, "Did I not tell you that if you believed you would see the glory of God?" The stone is removed. Jesus looks upward and prays aloud, and it's worth noticing exactly what he prays. Not a request. A statement of thanks for something already granted. "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." Even the prayer is explained, in the moment, as being partly for the benefit of the witnesses standing there. A detail that treats the crowd's belief as something actively being cultivated, not incidental. Then, with everyone watching, Jesus calls out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the man who died walks out of the tomb, his hands and feet still bound in the burial wrappings, his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus' final instruction is almost startlingly practical after everything that just happened. Unbind him and let him go. It's worth pausing on how the story ends, because it doesn't end with universal celebration. John records that many of the Jews who had come with Mary and seen what Jesus did believed in him, but others went straight to the Pharisees and reported what had happened. And this report becomes, according to John's own account, a direct trigger for the religious leadership's decision to plan Jesus' death. The chief priests and Pharisees convene a council, reasoning that if Jesus is left unchecked, his growing following could provoke a Roman crackdown that would cost them everything. From this point in John's Gospel forward, the narrative tension shifts unmistakably from will people believe in Jesus to how and when will the authorities move against him. There's a sharp, almost unbearable irony buried in that sequence, worth stating directly. The same miracle that proves Jesus has power over death is also the event that sets in motion the plan to kill him. Bringing Lazarus back to life doesn't just demonstrate who Jesus is. In the story's own internal logic, it's a direct catalyst for his own death sentence. That irony deepens further when you notice that Lazarus himself doesn't disappear from the story after this chapter. John records, just before the crucifixion narrative, that the chief priests specifically plotted to kill Lazarus too, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. Lazarus's continued existence, simply by being visibly alive and walking around Bethany, was itself functioning as ongoing, undeniable evidence for Jesus's claims. Evidence dangerous enough to the religious establishment that they considered a second execution just to make the first miracle's proof disappear. Scripture itself goes no further than this. The biblical text never records what ultimately happened to Lazarus after John's Gospel ends. But it's worth briefly noting, clearly flagged as later church tradition, rather than anything in the Bible itself, that various early Christian communities developed their own accounts of his later life. One tradition, especially strong in the Eastern churches, holds that Lazarus eventually left Judea, sailed to Cyprus, and became the first bishop of the city of Kition, living out the rest of his life there and being buried on the island, a tradition still marked today by a church in Larnaca said to stand over his tomb. A separate, competing tradition from the Western Church places him instead in Provence, in the south of France, claiming he became Bishop of Marseille before eventually being martyred. Neither account carries anything close to the historical weight of the Gospel text itself, and the two traditions can't both be literally true as written. But their very existence says something worth noting. Early Christian communities cared enough about this one supporting character, resurrected once, and then required to simply keep living an ordinary human life afterward, that they kept telling stories about where he went next, long after Scripture itself had gone quiet on the question. Before we get to that structural question, it's worth walking back through several smaller details in the exchange between Jesus and his disciples that tend to get skipped in a quick summary, because they add real texture to how this whole episode actually unfolds. When Jesus first tells his disciples Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, it's a startling thing to say about a friend's death. Glad, specifically, because the delay will produce a stronger, more undeniable demonstration for the disciples' own growing faith. This isn't casual indifference to Lazarus's death. It's a statement made with the ending already known, framed entirely around what this specific sequence of events will accomplish for the people watching it unfold. The disciples, notably, don't fully understand what Jesus means in the moment. Mark and the other Gospels record this pattern constantly. Disciples hearing a plain statement and still missing its full weight until events catch up to the words. It's also worth noticing the specific geography at play here, since it explains exactly why the disciples were so alarmed about the return trip. Bethany sat less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, close enough that mourners from the city had already traveled out to comfort Martha and Mary by the time Jesus arrives, and close enough that returning to this specific region put Jesus within easy reach of the same religious authorities who had recently tried to stone him in Jerusalem itself. The disciples' fear wasn't abstract caution about a vaguely dangerous region. It was a precise, immediate concern about walking Jesus back into the exact jurisdiction where his life had just been directly threatened. There's also something worth noting about why John, out of all 4 Gospel writers, is the only one who records this story at all, since Matthew, Mark, and Luke never mention Lazarus's raising anywhere in their own accounts. Scholars have offered a range of explanations for this gap, none of them universally agreed upon, but one commonly discussed possibility connects directly back to what happens to Lazarus after the miracle. If the earlier, so-called synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were written and circulated while Lazarus was potentially still alive, some scholars have suggested there may have been a reluctance to publicize, in written, widely copied form, the exact identity and location of a man the religious authorities had already reportedly discussed killing a second time specifically because of this miracle. John's Gospel, written later, after Lazarus had presumably already died a natural death, would have carried none of that same risk. This remains a proposed explanation rather than a settled fact, and other scholars point instead to John's broader, well-documented practice of selecting different material from the other Gospels entirely. organizing his account around those 7 distinct signs, rather than trying to reproduce the same episodes Matthew, Mark, and Luke had already covered. Either way, the simple fact that 3 of the 4 gospel writers leave out what modern readers often consider one of Jesus' most dramatic miracles is a useful reminder that the Gospels were never attempting to be 4 identical, exhaustive transcripts of the same 3 years. Each writer made deliberate choices about what to include, and John, alone among the 4, decided this particular story, ending in these particular 2 words, was essential to how he wanted his readers to understand who Jesus was. There's also a detail worth including about the tomb itself. Since first-century Jewish burial practice differed considerably from modern burial customs in ways that matter for understanding this scene correctly. Bodies were typically not embalmed in the Egyptian sense. Instead, they were wrapped tightly in linen cloths, often with a substantial quantity of spices intended to offset the smell of decomposition, and laid in a cave or a cut rock tomb, sealed with a large stone rolled across the entrance, precisely the kind of tomb both Lazarus and, significantly, Jesus himself would be placed in only a short time later. The physical staging of this scene, the stone that must be rolled away, the burial wrappings that must be removed afterward, deliberately anticipates, in exact physical detail, the resurrection narrative still to come at the end of John's Gospel, making this story function almost like a dress rehearsal. On a smaller scale, for the larger claim the entire Gospel is building toward, it's worth going a little further into how ordinary first-century Jewish people, apart from the formal Sadducee versus Pharisee debate over resurrection doctrine, tended to picture death itself, because that broader cultural backdrop shapes how devastating Lazarus's death would have felt to everyone standing in this scene. Much of the Hebrew Bible speaks of the dead going down to Sheol, a shadowy, largely undifferentiated realm beneath the earth, described in the Psalms and elsewhere less as a place of reward or punishment than as a kind of diminished, silent existence cut off from praise, from memory, from the vividness of ordinary life. "The dead do not praise the Lord," one psalm says bluntly, "nor do any who go down into silence." That's a bleaker, thinner picture of the afterlife than later Jewish and Christian theology would develop. And by Jesus' time, Jewish thought had grown considerably richer and more varied on the subject, partly under the influence of ideas that developed during the centuries of exile and the intertestamental period. But the older, starker Sheol imagery never fully disappeared from the emotional background of Jewish mourning. Death was widely treated, in everyday religious life, as a genuine severance, not necessarily the absolute annihilation the Sadducees taught, but a real, sorrowful separation from the world of the living, worth the full, loud, physically demonstrative mourning rituals the culture had built around it. This matters for reading the Lazarus story correctly, because it means Martha and Mary's grief wasn't softened by some casual, taken-for-granted assumption that death was obviously just a temporary inconvenience on the way to something better. Even within a religious culture that, in its more developed Pharisaic strand, affirmed a future resurrection, present, immediate death still meant a real and total loss of a brother's voice, presence, and daily companionship, with no guarantee of when, precisely, that far-off last-day restoration might actually arrive. Jesus stepping into that grief and weeping alongside it, rather than immediately reciting the reassuring doctrine, treats the loss with exactly the weight the culture around him already gave it. It's worth asking a question most retellings skip entirely. Why does John include this story at all? And why does he place it exactly where he does, as the last and greatest of the signs recorded before the crucifixion narrative begins? Scholars have long noted that John's Gospel is structured around a series of 7 specific miracles he calls signs, each one pointing beyond itself toward a larger claim about Jesus' identity. The raising of Lazarus is deliberately positioned as the climactic 7th sign, the one that most directly and undeniably demonstrates power over death itself, set up specifically to prepare the reader for the far larger claim the Gospel is building toward, Jesus' own resurrection, still several chapters away. There's also a detail easy to miss about how carefully John frames Martha and Mary as distinct individuals rather than interchangeable grieving sisters. Martha meets Jesus on the road, engages him theologically, and receives one of his clearest self-revelations recorded anywhere in Scripture. Mary meets him at the house, falls at his feet in unfiltered grief, and receives not theology but tears. Jesus meeting each woman exactly where she is, responding to Martha's need for reassurance with words, and to Mary's raw grief with shared grief rather than argument. The story doesn't flatten two different people into one generic response. It shows two different, equally valid ways of approaching loss, both met individually and specifically. It's worth pausing on something easy to rush past in the sequence of events here: the gap between Jesus arriving near Bethany and actually reaching the tomb. John records that Martha runs out to meet him, while Mary remained seated in the house, a detail that has generated real discussion, since it implies Mary either didn't yet know Jesus had arrived, or chose to stay in mourning until specifically summoned. When Martha quietly tells her, "The teacher is here, and is calling for you," Mary rose quickly and went to him, a sudden shift from stillness to urgency that the accompanying mourners misread entirely, assuming she's simply going to grieve further at the tomb, rather than going to meet Jesus himself. It's a small but telling detail about how easily a private, specific summons can be misread by onlookers, who only see the outward behavior, without the actual reason behind it. It's also worth pausing on the sheer social risk Mary takes, simply by getting up and going to Jesus in the middle of a formal mourning period, since first-century Jewish mourning customs placed real expectations on how a grieving person was supposed to behave in those first days after a death. Rising abruptly from the seated mourning position, in the middle of a house full of visiting comforters, to go meet someone outside would not have been a small or unremarkable action within that cultural setting. It's part of why the accompanying mourners immediately assume she must be heading to the tomb, rather than considering that she might simply be leaving to see someone who had just arrived. That the text specifically notes she rose quickly, rather than simply describing her walking out, underlines how sudden and how uncharacteristic of expected mourning etiquette this movement actually was. It's a small detail, easy to read past, but it adds one more layer to how completely Mary's grief and her devotion to Jesus were intertwined in this moment, enough to override, without a second thought, the normal social expectations of how a mourning woman in her position was supposed to conduct herself in front of an entire house full of watching guests. It's also worth naming what this passage does not say, since popular retellings sometimes overreach in the other direction. The text never suggests Jesus's tears were performative, staged for the crowd's benefit. In fact, it explicitly separates his private, visceral emotional response from the later prayer he does explicitly acknowledge is partly for the crowd's sake. The grief comes first, described in the rawest possible physical terms, well before any mention of an audience's reaction is factored into his own words. Whatever this passage is doing, it isn't presenting a Jesus who performs sadness for effect. It's worth pausing on the two different Greek words this passage actually uses for weeping. Because English translation flattens a distinction the original text goes out of its way to preserve. When John describes Mary and the accompanying mourners weeping, he uses kleo, a word regularly associated with loud, visible lamentation, the kind of audible group mourning typical of first-century Jewish funeral customs, which often involved hired professional mourners specifically to amplify grief publicly. But when John describes Jesus' own weeping 2 verses later, he switches to a completely different word, dakrio, which appears nowhere else in the entire New Testament. Dakrio describes something quieter, the shedding of tears specifically, without the loud lament implied by kleo. The distinction matters. John isn't simply saying Jesus joined in the same performative public mourning everyone around him was already doing. He's marking Jesus' response as something categorically different, quieter, more personal, and, by using a word found nowhere else in the entire New Testament, functionally singled out as unique in all of Scripture. This single, rare word choice has generated centuries of theological reflection, precisely because of how isolated it is. A word used exactly once, for exactly one person, in the entire New Testament, tends to draw outsized attention from careful readers. and it's worth understanding why. If John simply wanted to say, Jesus also cried like everyone else, he had a perfectly good word already sitting in the same paragraph, kleo, used twice, just before this verse. Choosing a different, rarer word instead reads, to most careful readers, as a deliberate authorial signal, whatever Jesus was doing in this moment. John wanted his readers to notice it wasn't identical to the surrounding public lament, even while remaining fully, unmistakably real grief. It's also worth situating this scene against ancient Near Eastern mourning customs more broadly, since first-century Jewish funeral practice was intensely communal and physically demonstrative compared to many modern Western funerals. Mourning periods were structured and lengthy, an initial period of most intense grief lasting about a week, called Shiva in later rabbinic tradition, followed by a full month of lighter mourning, and, for a parent, up to a year of ongoing remembrance. Professional mourners, including flute players and wailing women, were commonly hired specifically to amplify the sound and visibility of grief at a household in mourning, which explains why John describes such a substantial crowd of Jews accompanying Mary specifically to comfort her. 4 full days after the death, still actively present at the household rather than having already dispersed. It's worth adding one more small but meaningful detail about Martha's confession. Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world, because John's Gospel treats this exact sentence as carrying enormous structural weight elsewhere in the book. Near the very end of his Gospel, John states his own purpose for writing the entire account. These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. The overlap in wording is almost certainly intentional. Martha, grieving, exhausted, standing outside her brother's tomb before any miracle has happened, arrives at essentially the same confession John says he wrote his whole gospel to produce in every reader. In a book built around 7 signs meant to lead people toward belief, Martha reaches the destination early, without yet having seen the 7th and greatest sign performed at all. A quiet suggestion that the fullest response this story is asking for was never really about needing to see the miracle first. It's worth also placing the deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled language against its closest parallel elsewhere in John's own Gospel, because John uses strikingly similar phrasing again just a few chapters later, and the echo seems deliberate. As Jesus approaches his own arrest and crucifixion, John records him saying, "Now is my soul troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? But for this purpose I have come to this hour." The same undercurrent of visible, acknowledged inner turmoil shows up again, this time facing his own coming death rather than a friend's. Read side by side. These 2 moments suggest John isn't presenting an isolated, one-off lapse into emotion at Lazarus's tomb, quickly forgotten once the miracle is performed. He's presenting a consistent character trait carried all the way through to the end of the story, someone who approaches both a friend's death and his own impending death with the same unhidden inner disturbance, refusing in both cases to perform an easy, untroubled calm he doesn't actually feel. The Lazarus scene, in that light, isn't just a moment of grief over one man's death. It's a preview of exactly how this same person is going to carry himself when facing the far larger death still waiting for him at the end of the same gospel. There's a second, earlier moment in the Gospels worth placing directly alongside this one, because it shows Jesus weeping in a completely different emotional register, not personal grief over a friend's death, but grief over a coming national catastrophe. In Luke's Gospel, as Jesus approaches Jerusalem during the final week before his crucifixion, riding in on a donkey to the crowd's celebration, Luke records that when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes." This uses yet another Greek word, kleo, again, but the content of the grief is entirely different. Not a friend's death, but a coming judgment on an entire city that, in Jesus' own words, failed to recognize what was being offered to it. Taken together, these 2 weeping scenes, one deeply personal, one civic and prophetic, show a consistent pattern of Jesus responding to loss and coming loss with the same unguarded emotional honesty, regardless of the scale or nature of what's actually breaking his heart. It's also worth drawing a direct comparison to the two Old Testament resurrection accounts most similar in shape to this one, since they highlight exactly what makes the Lazarus account distinctive. The prophet Elijah raises a widow's son in the town of Zarephath by stretching himself out over the child's body 3 times and crying out to God in desperate, uncertain prayer. The text records real uncertainty in Elijah's plea, no confident foreknowledge of the outcome. His successor Elisha later raises the son of a Shunammite woman through a similarly physical, effortful process, lying on the child, praying, walking back and forth in the house before the boy finally revives. Both Old Testament accounts show God's prophets pleading with uncertain outcomes, physically strained, working toward a result they hope for, but cannot guarantee. Jesus' raising of Lazarus inverts this pattern entirely. There's no uncertain pleading, no physical strain, no doubt about outcomes stated anywhere in the text, only a single spoken command, "Lazarus, come out," preceded by a prayer of thanksgiving for something already granted. The contrast is almost certainly deliberate on John's part, where the prophets pleaded and strained toward an uncertain outcome. Jesus commands with settled, prior certainty, and yet, remarkably, still weeps genuinely along the way, refusing to let that certainty translate into emotional detachment from the grief in front of him. It's also worth noticing how this scene handles the disciples themselves in the run-up to the tomb, because their reactions form a quiet subplot running underneath the main confrontation between Jesus and the 2 grieving sisters. Beyond Thomas's striking line about being willing to die alongside Jesus, the broader group of disciples had genuine, practical reasons to be nervous about this specific trip that go beyond simple caution. They had, only recently in the Gospel's own timeline, watched a crowd in Jerusalem pick up stones to kill Jesus over what the religious leaders considered blasphemous claims about his own identity. The same territory of claims Jesus is about to repeat and expand on directly to Martha at the very edge of Bethany. Walking back into that same general region wasn't simply risky in the abstract. It meant walking back toward people who had already demonstrated, with actual stones in hand, exactly how far they were willing to go. And yet nothing in the text suggests the disciples seriously tried to talk Jesus out of it beyond that one initial warning. Once Jesus states his intention plainly, the group falls in behind him, Thomas's grim resolve standing in for what was presumably a shared, unspoken anxiety among all of them. It's a small but telling detail about the shape of discipleship as John's Gospel keeps depicting it throughout, not blind, cheerful confidence that nothing bad could happen, but a willingness to keep following even while fully aware of the specific, concrete danger involved, because loyalty to Jesus mattered more than personal safety calculated in the moment. There's a broader pattern worth drawing out here. Because this story doesn't stand alone in the Gospels, it fits a consistent shape found throughout Jesus' interactions with grief and suffering elsewhere. At the tomb of a widow's only son in the town of Nain, Luke records that Jesus, when he saw her, had compassion on her before raising the boy, compassion recorded as coming first, before the miracle, not as an afterthought to it. In the story of a father begging for help for his demon-afflicted son, Jesus responds not with clinical detachment, but with visible engagement in the Father's desperate plea. Across the Gospels, the pattern holds. The miracles are never described as detached demonstrations of raw power performed at a safe emotional distance. They are consistently shown arriving through, not instead of, genuine emotional engagement with the suffering person standing in front of him. It's worth pausing, too, on Martha's small, practical objection about the smell, because it's easy to read past as a throwaway detail when it's actually doing real narrative work. "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days," is, on the surface, an almost mundane, embarrassingly physical concern to raise in the middle of a moment this dramatic. But scholars and careful readers have long noted that this line functions as a kind of built-in safeguard against the exact skepticism a story like this would inevitably invite. By having Martha, someone who loved her brother and had every reason to want a miracle, voice the most obvious, physical objection to what's about to happen. John forecloses the easy explanation that Lazarus was somehow not really dead, merely unconscious, or in a deep coma later mistaken for death. Martha's own words confirm, from the person with the most intimate knowledge of the situation, that this is an actual, decomposing body 4 days into first-century burial conditions, with no embalming to slow the process. It's a small piece of internal evidence John includes, seemingly for exactly this reason, anticipating that some readers would look for a natural explanation, and closing that door before the miracle even happens, using the blunt, unglamorous testimony of the person least likely to exaggerate the situation for effect. It's worth returning to Martha and Mary one more time, because this isn't the only appearance they make in the Gospels, and seeing their fuller story adds real weight to this specific scene. Luke's Gospel records an earlier visit to the same household, where Martha is described as distracted with much serving, while Mary sits at Jesus' feet listening to his teaching, a scene often remembered mainly for Jesus' gentle correction that Mary has chosen the good portion. Read alongside the Lazarus story. A consistent character portrait emerges across both appearances, Martha as the practical, active, get-things-done sister, right down to worrying about the smell of a 4-day-old body, even in the middle of a miracle, Mary as the more emotionally expressive, contemplative one, sitting at Jesus' feet in both scenes, first to listen, later to weep. John's Gospel goes on to record one more appearance of this household, just before the crucifixion. A dinner at Bethany, where Mary anoints Jesus' feet with expensive perfume and wipes them with her hair, an act of extravagant devotion that Judas Iscariot criticizes as wasteful, and which Jesus defends as anticipating his burial. Read across all 3 scenes. This family functions almost like a quiet emotional through line, running underneath the more public dramatic events of Jesus' final year. Ordinary devoted friends, appearing at moments of teaching, grief, and impending death alike. It's worth adding one more layer to the Elijah and Elisha comparison already drawn out above, because the differences between those Old Testament resurrection accounts and this one go beyond just the presence or absence of confident certainty. In both Old Testament cases, the prophet is a clear intermediary, someone acting on God's behalf and explicitly, visibly dependent on God answering a specific request in that specific moment. Elijah's prayer is recorded almost as a plea laced with an edge of protest. "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn, by killing her son?" There's real vulnerability in that prayer, a prophet uncertain whether this particular request will be the one that finally goes unanswered. Jesus' prayer at Lazarus' tomb inverts that dynamic entirely. He doesn't ask for anything in the moment. He thanks the Father for something he says was already granted before he ever spoke a word aloud, and he explicitly frames the prayer as being for the benefit of the onlookers, rather than as a genuine request he's uncertain will be honored. Where Elijah and Elisha function as pleading intermediaries standing between the grieving family and a God whose response they cannot fully predict, Jesus in this scene occupies a strikingly different position, closer to the source of the power being exercised than to the prophets who had to beg for access to it on someone else's behalf. This is part of why so many readers across Christian history have treated the Lazarus story as functioning almost like an extended dramatized argument for who Jesus actually is, staged through action and comparison rather than stated outright as a formal doctrinal claim, an argument John's original readers, many of them already deeply familiar with the Elijah and Elisha accounts from their own scriptures, would have recognized and felt the weight of immediately. It's also worth naming directly why this passage has mattered so much historically to Christian reflection on suffering and divine emotion. Because Jesus wept has functioned, across centuries of theology, as one of the primary textual anchors for the claim that God is not distant or unmoved by human pain. Ancient Greek philosophical traditions, which shaped much of the intellectual world surrounding early Christianity, often assumed that true divinity required impassibility, freedom from being emotionally affected by anything outside oneself, since being moved by external events was seen as a kind of vulnerability incompatible with perfect, self-sufficient divine nature. The Gospel of John's willingness to record its central figure crying, viscerally shaken, standing at a graveside, sits in direct tension with that surrounding philosophical assumption. Theologians across many centuries and traditions have pointed to this exact verse as evidence that whatever divinity means in Christian theology, it does not require distance from real human suffering. A claim with obvious, practical comfort for anyone reading this story in the middle of their own grief, wondering whether their pain registers at all to whatever they believe stands behind the universe. This is also one of the passages most often reached for in real, contemporary grief counseling and funeral settings, and it's worth understanding why pastors, chaplains, and hospice workers keep returning to these two words specifically, rather than to any of the surrounding, more triumphant material about the resurrection itself. Grief counselors and pastoral care literature frequently point out that mourners in acute grief often aren't looking for someone to explain their loss, fix it, or rush them toward hope. What tends to help most in the immediate aftermath of a death is simply having their pain witnessed without being talked out of it. Jesus wept functions in countless funeral homilies and hospital bedside visits as scriptural permission to grieve fully and without embarrassment, specifically because it depicts the central figure of the entire faith doing exactly that at exactly the moment when a purely triumphant, skip straight to the miracle response would have been available to him, and he chose not to take it. Chaplains working in hospital and hospice settings often describe using this exact verse with grieving families as a way of countering a common but damaging assumption: the idea that strong faith should look like composed acceptance, dry eyes, and quick talk of a better place. This passage offers a different model entirely. Full, unhidden grief, sitting comfortably alongside full, unshaken faith in the same person, in the same few minutes, with neither one required to cancel out the other. It's frequently cited in grief literature precisely because it resists two opposite pastoral mistakes at once, neither minimizing loss with premature comfort, nor treating grief as evidence of weak or failing faith. The verse gives permission to do both at once, to believe fully and to weep fully, without treating either as a betrayal of the other. There's a final detail worth including about how this story has been received artistically and culturally across the centuries since it was written. Because it's one of the most frequently painted and sculpted scenes in the entire gospel tradition, Rembrandt, Giotto, and countless other artists across the medieval and early modern periods return to this exact moment repeatedly, often choosing to depict either the instant of the stone being rolled away or Jesus' visible grief just before it, rather than the more visually dramatic instant of Lazarus actually emerging from the tomb. That artistic choice, repeated across centuries and cultures, mirrors exactly the reading this video has been building toward. It's not primarily the miracle itself that has captured imagination and devotion for 2,000 years. It's the two words that come just before it. It's worth closing the loop, too, on what this story implies for the crowd standing around the tomb, since their reactions form their own small, easy-to-miss thread through the whole scene. Even before Lazarus emerges, John notes that Jesus prayed aloud partly for the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me, meaning at least part of what happens next is staged, quite deliberately, as public evidence rather than a private family matter. And the aftermath bears that out in both directions at once. Some of the mourners believe immediately, apparently persuaded on the spot by what they've just watched happen to a body they knew, beyond doubt, had been dead for 4 days. Others, just as immediately, walk straight to the religious authorities to report it, not doubting what they saw, notably, but treating it as a threat to be managed rather than a wonder to be embraced. That split reaction is worth sitting with, because it undercuts any assumption that a sufficiently dramatic miracle simply forces belief on everyone who witnesses it. The same event, watched by the same crowd, in the same moment, produces genuine faith in some and calculated political anxiety in others, a pattern that shows up repeatedly across all 4 Gospels, where seeing turns out not to be, by itself, a guarantee of believing. Whatever this story is arguing about Jesus' identity, it isn't arguing that evidence alone settles every heart the same way. So what does all of this add up to? Jesus wept is only 2 words, the shortest sentence in the entire Bible, and it's tempting to read straight past it on the way to the more dramatic moment that follows. But sitting with it directly reveals something the rest of the story would be poorer without. A portrait of someone who holds absolute power over life and death in one hand, and genuine, unguarded human grief in the other, refusing to let either one cancel out or diminish the other. He does not need to cry, he chooses to, not because the ending is in doubt, but because the pain in front of him is real, and real pain, in this account, is never treated as beneath a direct, honest response, even from someone who already knows exactly how the story is about to end. If this gave you a way of seeing this story you'd never seen before, that is genuinely the whole point of this channel. If you want to go deeper into what Scripture actually says, the next thing you should watch is right there on your screen right now. Click it to keep exploring the Bible with us. Thank you for being here. God bless you.